I don't want to build my reality around rules that were made up by men who didn't even have access to toilet paper. If you couldn't even wipe your ass properly, I don't think that I have to build my entire reality around what you think or what you thought before you could even wipe your fucking ass. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to the Freedom Collective podcast, y'all. Y'all, again, I appreciate all the support. The podcast is doing pretty good. It's a grower. It's a grower. We're in this thing together, and y'all have been really showing up. I appreciate every comment, every like, every review. If you could, please leave a positive review. If it's less than 5 stars, contemplate on it before you leave it. But please leave a review. This episode, I expect this one to be a little controversial. And that's okay. Like I said before, we're gonna hold each other's hands. We're gonna walk through it, but we can't get started. We're not gonna jump straight into it like that. And I'm gonna slow walk us to it. But I do want to thank y'all for showing up. And if you're listening to this and you probably seen a clip on the internet, I'm gonna ask, okay, that you listen to the whole thing, react or respond rather after you've listened to the whole thing, because I'm going to be talking about a lot of things that require context, and context is going to be what matters. If you turn off your brain before you're able to listen to the full episode, you're not going to receive what I'm saying, and you may misinterpret what I'm saying. But that's just like a little prelude to what we're getting into today. But naturally, we have to start off with the intake segment because I don't like to get all hot and heavy just right off the intro. So let's just start with our intake question of the day. Today's intake question is, what is your best trait? I think that's such a good question. And again, if you are listening, please engage. If you go to the YouTube, which please subscribe. If you go to the YouTube, you can leave your answer there. If you go to the Instagram. You can leave your answer on the Instagram, but I want to know what you think your strongest trait is. But as for me, I'm gonna shout out to my people, black people. Okay. I think one of my best traits is that I'm resilient. Through the face of adversity, like many other people, I believe like I can rise to the challenge and that I can find solutions, and I'm community oriented. That's a huge part of who I am. And that is a protective factor when it comes to resiliency. So I really value and appreciate my own sense of resiliency. And if you're listening, you're probably resilient too, because hell, you're here. Okay. But yeah, I really appreciate and admire that trait in myself. And if you're somebody who knows me who thinks I'm not resilient, please keep that thought to yourself as well. But yeah, y'all, I'm excited for today's episode, but also like I know there's potential for blowback if it gets in the wrong hands, because a lot of people don't like to listen to these things, right? But this episode is going to be about the social construct of whiteness. There's been a lot of things happening in the world, as there always is, that just frankly points back to, all fingers point back to this like misbelieved, made up concept of what whiteness is. And I think a lot of the issues we're having as a society is a direct result of people being incapable of understanding exactly what we're living in and what we're dealing with. So I'm hoping that we can get to the nitty gritty today. Okay. So in this segment of the journey today, it is addressed at the whites. Dear white people, dear white people, this is going to be your episode. I don't speak to white people directly very often, but this is going to be the episode that is for you. But it's for other people too, because I think we all need to understand exactly what whiteness is and how harmful it can be as a concept, not just for everybody who isn't white, because we know that, but also for white people as well. And if you hold my hand through this, I believe we can get through it together. Okay. To start, we're gonna start on a note, okay? Is being white a mental illness? I know you're gonna say, no, that's absolutely absurd. That's ridiculous. And I'm gonna argue that that is a more complex question than you think. I am gonna cite my sources. So give me a moment and I'm gonna paint a picture for y'all. Or at least I could hopefully try to paint a picture for everybody that's listening. I cannot talk about whiteness without talking about white history. But before we even get into the white history aspect of everything, right? I want to talk about whiteness and race in general as a social construct, because I know a lot of people aren't introduced to what social constructs are, and that's by design, because the more people who are aware of what social constructs are, the less likely people are to buy into them, right? And society functions as a contract we all sign unknowingly, not through physical means, right? Like not signing on a contract literally, but like we all sign a social contract to participate in these systems and these customs that vary from place to place, but it's all constructed. First, I'm gonna break it down like I'm talking to a 5-year-old. And I'm not insulting y'all saying that y'all are 5, but I'm saying, like, I like to break concepts down to the point where everybody can understand them. And it's my hope that through shared understanding, we can have the conversation. You cannot have a conversation with somebody if y'all are talking about two separate things. So I want y'all to understand what I'm talking about when I say that race is socially constructed, right? Imagine for a moment you're playing with a box of crayons. Somewhere along the way, while you're playing with this box of crayons, you decide that yellow is what you can use to color the sun. Blue is what you can use to color the sky. Could you use the color blue to color a fish? Yes. Could you use the color blue to color like the landscape? Could you use the color yellow to color a flower? Absolutely. But because these rules were set into place while you're playing with these crayons, you don't use the color blue for anything else. You associate the color blue and yellow with these two things, right? Doesn't really seem realistic. But I also want to highlight that some things are biological in through nature and some things aren't, right? There's a difference between a mountain, for example, and a border. A border is a rule that is socially constructed because there's no real line dividing these lands up between two people, but a mountain is a thing. You can point at a mountain and know that's a mountain, but a border can shift, it can change over time. It is something that can shift and change. But back to the crayons. Race is something like crayons, where people saw that there were multiple colors of shades of skin, and that is a direct result of melanin, which is biological. That is something that is a result of where our ancestors lived. Okay. Our people adjusted to different environments, and those environments have, in some way, shape, or form, created over time, like more melanin in people's skin and less melanin in people's skin. Okay. That is biological. Race is not. That is a rule that we all agreed on, most of us have agreed on, because it helps us to categorize things. And if you want to say, well, yeah, people's different melanins make them like different, like in many ways, I would say that there are people who are not black who have heavy melanin. Like, right, there are darker skinned people in, for example, India. Those people are not black. They are Asian, Southeast Asian, but they are still people with high melanin concentration. And I want to be very clear too, race, although it is a social construct, it is still very much real. It has in real life implications on people's lives. I'm not dismissing the reality of the role that race plays. I'm simply painting the picture of how race is socially constructed. Okay, it is a made up rule of how we classify people and categorize them in society. Biologically, human beings are 99.99% identical, despite melanin content. And it is important to note that we are all people. And the reason why we've created these constructs is because it benefits people in power. Human beings took these small differences between us, like melanin, uh-huh, in geography, and use that to categorize us. It is similar to taking a bowl of jelly beans and separating them by color as opposed to flavor, right? Think about it. There are so many ways you could categorize human beings, but we chose melanin content and geography as a ways to do that. And mind you, heritage and ethnicity are all connected to these things too. I'm not discounting that, although they are a social construct, they have very in real life implications, and they are connected to heritage and things like that. I'm not discounting that. I'm just trying to explain why exactly race is treated in the ways in which it is. These rules also change over time. Think about it. Who was considered white in the beginning of US history versus who is considered white now is different. In many ways, Jewish people were not considered white when they were first like settling here in the United States, and now they are largely incorporated. That may be controversial to some because some people hold on to their ethnicity as Jewish people, but I'm not talking about ethnicity. I'm talking about race. Some people are racially white and still ethnically Jewish. You can take of that what you will, but yeah, Irish people were not really considered to be white when they first immigrated here to the United States. And that is largely due to what happens to whiteness in general, right? In the grand scheme of human history, whiteness is a fairly new construct. Back when white people were in Europe before colonization was based off of ethnicity, it was based off of geography, where you were from, nationality, things along those lines. And again, we're about to get into white history, and I'm going to lean heavily on this one book that I really just cannot recommend enough called My Grandmother's Hands, because it does a really good job at delving into the complexities of whiteness and the history behind that whiteness and white supremacy and how it lives in the body. Okay. And I know a lot of people are going to immediately turn this podcast off once they hear that. But again, I cannot emphasize enough that there's so much trauma that comes along with these social constructs, again, because they have in real life implications. It is important for us to be able to name that. And white people will never be free, and we will never be free as a direct result of a lot of white people's inability to process around what whiteness is and to address the trauma that comes from the way that whiteness was formed. Look, is it a mental illness? I would say, that's complex. But I will say there's a lot of mental illness that is a direct result of unaddressed racial trauma that's happened over the course of history. I'm going to read a little excerpt from My Grandmother's Hands, where he is talking about the book Post Traumatic Slave Syndrome, which is a book by Dr. Joy DeGruy. And it starts with, as we know, without a clear and present focus on the body, trauma cannot be fully addressed. One of the purposes of My Grandmother's Hands is to build on DeGruy's important work. Another purpose of this is to look further backwards in time than DeGruy did in post traumatic slave syndrome. Post traumatic slave syndrome begins its investigation in the year 1619 when the first Africans arrived to America. These human beings were kidnapped, placed in chains, forcibly relocated, and sold into enslavement to immigrants from Europe and their descendants. However, trauma of this kind did not start in the beginning of 1916. For thousands of years before that, human beings murdered, butchered, tortured, oppressed, abused, conquered, enslaved, and colonized one another. While people from England, Spain, Portugal, France, Scotland, Sweden, and Holland had all colonized parts of America by the late 1600s, it was the English who controlled nearly all the colonized territories in what would become the United States in 1776. The 1500s and 1600s in England were anything but gentle times. People were routinely burned at the stake for hearsay, a practice that began in the 12th century and continued through 1612. Torture was an official instrument of the English government until 1640. The famous Tower of London was, in part, a huge torture chamber. One of many torture devices in the tower, the rack, was used to stretch human bodies and pull them apart. Here is the description of the apparatus at work. This caused terrible pain for the victim, as well as increasing physical damage as the torture continued. Tendons were ripped, joints separated, and bones fractured. The sound of muscles and tendons tearing and snapping provided audible signs of damage being done. During the Middle Ages in England, torture wasn't just widely popular, it was a spectator sport. In his essay, Violence and the Law of Medieval England, historian Sean McGlynn puts it in this way. Throughout the whole medieval period, there was a popular demand for malefactors to receive punishment that was both harsh and purposely terrifying. This reflected people's enthusiasm and the desire to see justice being done. There was even an executions transfer market where bids were made to stage the executions of condemned men in front of home crowds. Mutilations Mutilation sent out a message of warning and deterrence. Executions offered the ultimate guarantee against repeat offenders. With few prisons and no police force, severe punishment was deemed invaluable and a deterrent to crime. In her book, A Distant Mirror, Barbara Tuchman offers this parallel description of everyday life in medieval England. The tortures and punishments of civil justice customarily cut off hands and ears, racked, burned, flayed, and pulled apart people's bodies. In everyday life, passers-by saw some criminal flogged with a knotted rope or chained up right in an iron collar. They passed corpses hanging on the gibbet and decapitated heads and quartered bodies impaled on stakes on the city walls. It is not hard to understand why so many people from England fled to the American colonies. Fleeing is, of course, a survival response. Many of the English who colonized America have been brutalized or had witnessed great brutality firsthand. Others were the children and grandchildren of people who had experienced such savagery in England. Now, barbarianism was not the only reason to flee England. The Great Plague raged through much of the country in 1665 and 1666, killing an estimated 100,000 people in London alone, almost a quarter of the city's population. In the village of Eyam, the plague killed 4 out of 5 residents over 14 months. Many English immigrants were desperately trying to get away from poverty, starvation, and overcrowding. For all their talk of the New Jerusalem, the Pilgrims and the Puritans were not explorers. They were refugees fleeing imprisonment, torture, and mutilation. In England, one Puritan writer, William Prine, had his ears cut off and his forehead branded, burned with red-hot iron with the letters SL, which stood for seditious libeler. Another Puritan, John Lilburne, was flogged with a whip, dragged by an ox cart through London, and forced into a pillory. Others had their noses split or their tongues bored with hot irons. In post-traumatic slave syndrome, DeGruy asked, isn't it likely that many slaves were severely traumatized? Furthermore, did the trauma and the effects of such horrific abuse end with the abolition of slavery? We need to ask these same questions about the English colonists who made their way to America. Isn't it likely that many of them were traumatized by the time they arrived here? Did over 10 centuries of medieval brutality, which was inflicted on white bodies by other white bodies, begin to look like culture? Did this integrational trauma and its effect end with European immigrants' arrival in the New World? The trauma that now lives in the bodies of so many African Americans did not begin when those bodies first encountered white ones. This trauma can be traced back much further through generation upon generation of white bodies to medieval Europe. For America to outgrow the bondage of white body supremacy, white Americans need to imagine themselves in black bodies and experience what those bodies had to endure. They also need to do the same with the bodies of their own white ancestors, and they need to ask themselves this question. If we don't address our ancient historical trauma, what will we pass down to our children and to their children and grandchildren? Listen, I cannot recommend that book enough, but that is just simply an excerpt. And I think if you really want to get into why it is important to know your history as a white person that doesn't just start with your people landing foot here in the United States, you have to trace it back to how barbaric the medieval times were. With that being said, I believe that white fear is something that is epigenetic. It is something that white people have living in their bodies that stems from generations of trauma and torture and pain that stem from other white people. Again, this is before the construct of whiteness was even created, because it was created in Europe. This is before that was created, right? Going through the medieval times, going back to the medieval times and how torturous and brutal it was. And this white fear creates such a ripple effect out into the rest of the world, or it has as a direct result of colonization and things like fascism. Fascism and white fear are so deeply interwoven. I've done deep dives on this before, how white fear can be really weaponized by any manipulative or charismatic leader to create systems of brutality, not only for those white people who are subject to that manipulation, but especially for everybody else who is not white. Fascism typically revolves around the fear of others, right? If you look at our society today, a lot of the fear that we are dealing with is a lot of the demonization of trans people, the demonization of immigrants, calling immigrants violent when you yourselves are the direct result of people who immigrated to this country, colonized this country. And I think that these things cannot be disconnected. And what I really want to do in this episode is emphasize that white people cannot get free because they themselves are in bondage, the bondage of a social contract that they believe to be like law, that they believe to be biological, that is simply like holding them back and us back, everybody else. And I just want to create the conversation around how can white people do this? But more importantly, what do white people need to know about how easy it is to manipulate them and why it's easy to manipulate white people? And it's because like that fear lives genetically in their bodies. Okay. Is being white a mental illness? The jury's still out on that, but I will say there's a lot of things that can contribute to mental unwellness. And I believe you have to be mentally unwell to be so fearful that you co sign the brutality, the torture, and the hurt and harm of other groups of people for no good reason at all outside of a fear of lack. I believe that this fear that lives deep down in white people also contributes to them being complacent in the face of fascism. We've seen fascism on the rise here. Some people want to believe it, some people don't. Like the fear is so deep that some people are still in some people are still in Delulu land and refuse to acknowledge the writing that's on the wall. Donald Trump, the president, has been able to gain over 1 billion. Now I'm not saying million, right? Because even that's wrong, but billion. Well over $1 billion since getting back into office for his second term, enriching himself on the American people. But he has mastered the art of manipulating white fear so much that they don't care that they are being like robbed with the rest of us, mind you, but they are being robbed and manipulated at the same time. And I think since white people are so fearful as a direct result of coming from brutality, that they don't recognize it and they refuse to recognize it. A lot of people won't hear this, and that's cool. But I do think like having these conversations and equipping the white people who do hear it to have conversations with their people, to have them hear it is going to be important. I'm not the messenger for everybody, but for the people who I am the messenger for, please go forth and be fruitful, spread the knowledge because your people need to hear it the most. But like I said, white complacency in the face of things like fascism is a direct result of that deep seated trauma that comes from years, centuries of torture, trauma that is just of completely unaddressed. And we talk often about how people who are not white have to like unlive the trauma of coming in contact with whiteness and what that means as a social construct. But we don't often talk about how white people are subjects to that same brutality. The construct needs to be thrown in the trash, along with a number of other social constructs. But we don't address it like as what it is often enough for me, and that is a social construct, social contract that white people have forced on the rest of the world that has resulted in honestly the dying because of our planet. Okay, I believe that like whiteness as a whole is killing the planet. I can't believe I'm going to have to clarify this, but when I say whiteness as a social construct, I'm not talking about people who are classified as white necessarily. There are some people who are more egregious violators than others, but I'm not talking about white people as specific units. So if that is what you're hearing, I'm going to have you go back to the beginning and start over, right? Because I'm talking about whiteness as a social construct, the social contract that is race and how it is used to pretty much brutalize other people without scruples. This brings me to the concept of white supremacy culture, too, right? The 15 tenets of white supremacy culture. I've done a deep dive and I have a series on my TikTok. If anybody's interested in going, you can click the top of my page. There's a playlist that picks apart and delves into each tenet of white supremacy culture. But these tenets of white supremacy culture create the cognitive dissonance required for a white person to disconnect themselves from what it is that is also holding them back and down too, which is white supremacy. The culture that centers whiteness and teaches white people that dominance is the only way. I like to think of these systems, these large systems, as these monsters that have these like self-protective mechanisms, right? I think of a hydra. If you cut the head off of a hydra, it'll double and come back. The way that white supremacy culture and the tenets of white supremacy culture work is that they operate to protect whiteness and to keep white people disillusioned from what it is that they are participating in. And once you understand how these things show up and you have the knowledge and the ability to challenge these things as they show up, you'll begin to see the cracks in the armor and how desperate people clinging on to white supremacy culture and how they want to have people be fearful, how they can easily manipulate you by using these tenets of white supremacy culture. It happens all day. And I promise once you get into it, you'll be like, okay, it's everywhere. But I'm just going to go through each of the 15 and I might break down a couple just so I can explain it to you. I'm not going to do the whole kit and caboodle because I've done this before. I've done like a whole series breaking it down if you really want it. But these tenants are literally everywhere in our society. And it's basically this big game of gaslight that happens to us all day long. And I'm not just talking about us people who are black, but white people too. White people who challenge white supremacy culture often meet the boot of white supremacy culture. Think of people like Renee Good and Alex Preddy. These are two white people who had the gall to stand up against the fear that was generated by white supremacists to create a dissonance between white people and what is actually happening to everybody, right? Again, we have a president who's enriching himself and his rich friends, who is a part of a PDF ring, and anybody, any white person who dares to stand up and challenge like the white supremacy that is required to have these things operate, they are immediately dismissed from white supremacy culture and they are punished as a result. They are killed. And this happens in big ways that are publicized, like Alex Preddy and Renee Good, and in small ways that aren't, being ostracized from like white culture. It happens. The reason why so many people are so fearful of things like leaving MAGA is because they understand that when they do so, they will lose the community that they've been built to have their entire lives. When someone is evangelical and they leave the evangelical church or the practice, they lose community because their communities are built around these things. But when you challenge these tenets enough, you basically have to go. But these 15 tenets are perfectionism as a sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, only one right way, paternalism, right to comfort. That's a really big one, y'all. That actually sparked my series a few years ago. There's either or thinking, there's power hoarding, fear of open conflict. That's another one. Individualism, I'm the only one. Progress is bigger and more, and objectivity. These tenets of white supremacy culture literally are the self-protective mechanism of white supremacy that keeps white people disillusioned. And a lot of white people will hear these conversations and think that people are speaking gibberish and they think that we're the ones brainwashing other people. But the reality is they're so deep in drinking the Kool-Aid that they cannot imagine what their lives would look like outside of how they've been taught to behave and act. Again, it goes back to social construct. These are social contracts that we all buy into unknowingly because of randomization, like where we're born, how we're born. And we believe that these things are fact and not made up rules that somebody came up with 100 years ago, hundreds of years ago, right? I calling me confused, but I don't want to build my reality around rules that were made up by men who didn't even have access to toilet paper. If you couldn't even wipe your ass properly, I don't think that I have to build my entire reality around what you think or what you thought before you could even wipe your fucking ass. And I think many of us need to start thinking of it like that, right? We are participating in systems that were built by men who couldn't even wash their ass, couldn't even spread both cheeks and wipe. I think it may be time for us to imagine a new reality moving forward. And I think we're actually in the process of doing that. And these conversations is how we do that as a whole. Okay, so I'm going to break down a couple of these tenets. Okay, I'm going to do right to comfort and fear of open conflict. And I'm going to read because I think this is important information. I don't want to mince it at all. The right to comfort shows up as the belief that those with power have a right to emotional and psychological comfort, Another aspect of value and logic over emotion. Scapegoating those who cause discomfort, for example, targeting and isolating those who name racism rather than addressing the actual racism that is being named, demanding, requiring, expecting apologies or other forms of I didn't mean it when faced with accusations of colluding with racism, feeling entitled to name what is and isn't racism, feeling entitled to dictate how racism should and shouldn't be named, demanding that those naming racism must be calm and logical, while those protesting its naming can be angry and illogical, white people or those with dominant identities equating individual acts of unfairness with systemic racism or other forms of oppression. So, I actually want to call back into attention what happened at the BAFTAs with Delroy and Michael B. Jordan. When they were on the stage, a white man with Tourette's screamed the N word, and the BBC did not edit it out. I want to be clear, right? I understand and know that Tourette's has involuntary tics, and some of those tics are verbal and it can result in people saying things that are really inappropriate, even if they don't mean those things, because that is just the way that Tourette's works. I am not taking anything away from the disorder, but the conversation around what happened at the BAFTAs was so puzzling because instead of being able to recognize, like, okay, racism happened here, white people did what white people do best and they demanded a right to comfort. Yeah, was the word that was screamed at Delroy and Michael B. Jordan like a racist one that has hundreds of years of history of torture, brutality, murder, you name it, behind it? Of course, but you cannot make this white man feel uncomfortable or other white people feel uncomfortable by having to address that that was racist and it could have been handled better. That is what happened. That's textbook right to comfort right there. And I think even in the way that people online manage the conversation around it, that any black person who was upset at hearing the N-word being hurled at two black men who work very hard in their field, like that they were like being unreasonable, that we had to couch how we responded. We weren't allowed to have feelings about it. The whole thing. Y'all, this is all textbook white supremacy at work. Like literally the self defending mechanism, and so many white people refuse to hear that. In fact, I saw a lot of white people who typically claim, I'll say claim to have a praxis that leans towards anti racist. They too were saying black people need to be quiet. This is uncomfortable. We can't have these conversations because it's uncomfortable. White people have a right to comfort, and we should not have these conversations. In fact, you should be understanding and you should shut up. That is it in a nutshell. But let's move on to fear of open conflict, okay? This is how fear of open conflict shows up. People in power are scared of expressed conflict and try to ignore it or run from it. When someone raises an issue that causes discomfort, the response is to blame the person for raising the issue rather than look at the issue which is actually causing the problem. One of the apologies that came out immediately after the BAFTA situation, one of the representatives from the BBC said something along the lines of, "I'm disappointed that certain aspects of the media feel a way about this," blaming the people who were upset by a racial slur. Like again, you can't make this up. And I'm just using this BAFTA incident as one clear example of how this happens. But I promise if you look around enough, you will see it everywhere else. In fact, after I finish this, I'm gonna explain to you what actually how fear of open conflict and right to comfort really started me talking about this publicly. But again, fear of open conflict can also show up as an emphasis on assistance of being polite, setting the rules for how ideas or information on differences or opinions need to be shared in order to be heard. In other words, requiring that people calm down if they are angry, when anger often contains deep wisdom about where the underlying hurt or harm lies, they have to not be angry. If you're angry, for example, as a black person after being called a racial slur, you're unreasonable and you can't be taken seriously. And even though that was deeply offensive, and accommodations could have easily handled that, even though editing could have taken the slur out, even though there are ways that this could have been avoided, you're wrong now because you're angry. Okay. It shows up as equating the raising of difficult issues with being impolite rude, or out of line, punishing people either overtly or subtly for speaking out about their truth and or experience. Everybody in here, raise your hand. I know y'all not really in here, but raise your hand if you've ever experienced being told that as a direct result of how you have responded to a disrespect that you are now the problem. Okay, everybody now put your hands down. Okay, it also shows up as labeling emotion as irrational or anti intellectual or inferior, which means failing to recognize the importance of emotional intelligence. There is no emotional intelligence when it comes to the white supremacist tenet of protecting itself from outrage. Because if you're angry, you then become the problem. Because your anger invalidates anything that you are saying, and because you're feeling things, you are now the problem. That is something that's like very rife in our culture. Again, it seeps out into our interpersonal lives. It seeps out into the public. If you pay attention enough, I promise you'll find all of these things. But lastly, it shows up as pretending or insisting that our point of view is grounded in the rational or the intellectual when we are in fact masking our emotions with what appears to be rational or intellectual arguments, right? A white person, and I've experienced this many times, a white person who is like really dedicated to the bit of white supremacy will tell you that you having any emotions whatsoever means that you are wrong. Me, I'm approaching this in a logical way, therefore I am right. And the logical way will be just like, frankly, them feeling disgust or distaste or anger or rage about their circumstances or other people and projecting that onto a lot of other people. Look, I can go deeply into this. I have gone deeply into this. Like, if you want to hear like all of the 15 tenets being broken down and how they can show up, I just really ask that you go back and go to my TikTok page and please listen. That's a good playlist. I really stand by that playlist. But with that, I have to really note too that whiteness is dehumanizing. When you sign up this when you sign up for this social construct that is whiteness and what whiteness can mean for you, you are not only dehumanizing the other people who aren't white, you're dehumanizing yourself. It is not healthy for anybody involved to be incapable of questioning or challenging things. Or if you do question and challenge things, you're immediately ostracized or put away from the people who you're closest to. It is an abusive relationship, frankly, that people who are classified as white they have with the classification of whiteness itself, right? There is an abusive relationship between whiteness and white people. And a lot of white people won't hear that. And I know a lot of people are probably going to be like, why are you centering an entire episode around whiteness? Like talking about white to white people about whiteness is just like futile. I'm going to say this. I think white people are in the bag of this social contract, it has really dangerous implications for the rest of the world. And I think that's evident in how we've seen the environment be treated, right? How Black and brown neighborhoods are becoming targets for these data centers or these centers for these AI companies where they're polluting those environments. And because white supremacy has it to where they won't be in a white neighborhood, but it will be in these Black and brown neighborhoods, they think that it won't have an impact on them, but the reality is that they're contributing to the harm of our environment. Did you know that there are ways to do these data processing centers without like using all of the water and polluting the environment so much? But it's so easy to dehumanize entire groups of people that we do it the least ethical way. Did you know that? There are ways to cool down these data centers without even fucking up the environment, but because white people, okay, the construct of white people, because whiteness is so fucking racist and like dehumanizes people so much they don't even understand that these things double back and impact them as well. Yeah, that's what I know. But yeah, whiteness is dehumanizing. It strips you of your ability to empathize with other people. It strips you of the connectivity, the full range of emotional output. It strips you from the things that make a person human. I believe like experiencing a full range of emotions is so integral to being human, and whiteness takes that away from people. Okay. As it strips it from other people, it strips it away from them as well. The BAFTA situation is yet another example of a long line of examples that exemplify this. There's this other incident with this white girl here in New York City who got off the train and called this group of Black girls a racial slur, the N word, after they were yelling at her for calling a man who was of Hispanic and Latino heritage a slur too. She was taking up space on the train because she felt entitled to the space on the train. The black girl said, absolutely not. This is not how you share public space. And then, as a result of her calling these black girls the N word, we saw like people in droves, one, insult the black girls for standing up for their fellow person, but two, also praise this girl called the now dubbing the subway queen. They are praising this girl for calling other people a racial slur after she tried to take up space on a public shared space. She tried to take up space for herself, and as a result, this speaks to how dehumanizing whiteness is. It disconnects you from humanity, not only your own but other people's. And we praise this because, again, white supremacy is self protective, it protects itself through culture. Culture is one of those ways that it happens. How people who do things like this can be praised. How someone, again, the man at the BAFTAs, he has Tourette's. I don't doubt that. I'm not questioning the legitimacy of his condition. I am, however, questioning the response. Why are people so quick to dismiss black pain? Okay, think about it. It's dehumanizing. The goal in and of itself is to dehumanize. And because of white supremacy culture, it is so easy again to manipulate white people. Look at the entire MAGA movement. These people have gotten every single cue that is possible that that man, okay, that is at the center of the entire movement is like a crook who is scamming. Okay. No president in the history of the United States have ever enriched themselves in the way that this man has enriched themselves. He has tore down a literal part of history in the Rose Garden to build a private sector backed ballroom. I'm telling you, there's just so many things that I can point to. This man has been held liable for sexual assault. I interviewed one of his victims. Yes, I interviewed literally with a microphone speaking to this woman who was sexually assaulted by our president. But that means nothing when the president, not my president, y'all's president, is in alignment with the agenda of white supremacy. It will do anything to create a dissonance that will protect itself from having to face the reality that maybe, just maybe, the social contract that we've all been forced to buy into is not one that we need to perpetuate moving forward to the point where we will hurt and harm ourselves and others in order to maintain it. And that's to the people who subscribe to white supremacy. Now look, I will say that there is no way for us to like really just jump out of this contract all willy nilly. Again, like I said multiple times, there are very in real life implications. I don't think race as a construct will just completely disappear overnight. But I think the way that we begin to at least shift what it means and how we can deconstruct these things is through having these conversations. I also want to shout out the Afro pessimist. Okay, what is Afro pessimism? I know because some people going to ask. Afro pessimism is the belief that blackness is not just about race, it is a ontological position of social death and slave status. Okay, ontological. That means it's a way of being, of existing. It's not just about a construct. Since Afro-pessimism really revolves around this idea of a social death. The transatlantic slave trade, which is the beginning of chattel slavery, where people were enslaved specifically because of this construct of race, it is this idea that that was a social death. That really was the beginning of the end of I don't want to say beginning of the end, but like that is really a stain on human existence where black people have been again, the social construct of blackness has been created to be a class of people of slaves that are in direct opposition to what it means to be human, right? Because black people have been designated as slavery. I'm not saying you have to, as property. I'm not saying that you have to buy into this like social positioning that is Afro pessimism, but I do believe they make some really valid points because black people, in the grand scheme of this entire thing, if they represent the direct opposition to what white supremacy seeks to have people believe that whiteness is the peak of humanity, then black people are in direct opposition and seen as property. And that is like one of the undercurrents of what makes these conversations around like the BAFTAs and things like that or like policy that impacts black people, like data centers going up that are poisoning the environment. This is what creates this dissonance because a lot of people do not see black people as people. Because I would argue they have been stripped of their humanity to be able to see other human beings as human beings. But this goes back again to white history of them doing it to each other first. We just went down a rabbit hole. I hope that this conversation is making sense, y'all. But I just cannot emphasize enough that whiteness is poison. There are some people who will not understand past me saying that and I'm not a stranger to this. I had a college presentation. I had a queer studies class when I was in college, and I had a really viral presentation that said white people are a plague to humanity. And what they failed to read was the subcaption, which said the ties between colonization and homophobia in communities of color. Because colonization can literally like be traced as the root of a lot of homophobia in communities of color because of the demonization of queer people being used to justify colonization, the subjugation of black and brown people, painting people as gendered and sexual oriented deviants as a means to justify colonizing because you can create that dissonance if you believe that what you're doing is just. Okay, if you believe that the subjugation of other groups of people is just, you will of course believe that there's nothing wrong with subjecting people to torture and harm. Again, white people have done that to themselves for centuries. So I am not shocked or surprised that it has resulted in them doing it to other people around the world. But until white people are capable of accepting and acknowledging that, we won't go anywhere. We won't get anywhere. And they have to, and this is where the therapy of it all comes in, right? Until white people are willing to address that trauma, the trauma that has been white torture and I'll say European torture and harm over the course of centuries, until they're willing to also address white torture and harm done over the course of history here in the United States and other parts of the world, there will be no movement. And it's a shame that we have to keep reminding people to do this, but yeah, I had to take it. I had to take it there. A lot of the things that we're seeing in the world right now are a direct result of white people being incapable of processing trauma and harm and projecting that onto other people, notably people who are not white, especially black people. And it's to the point where it poisons them too, but they won't acknowledge it because it's a social contract that they've been forced to buy into. And if you're white and you're listening to this, I hope that this inspires you to think about it a little deeper how white supremacy shows up in your life, how the contract that is whiteness shows up in your life, how it disconnects you from your humanity, because it does. That's what it's designed to do in order to justify doing murderous and torturous stuff, in order to justify hurting and harming other people. What happens when you speak out against it? I don't know. Ask Alex Preddy. Ask Renee Good. So, is whiteness a mental illness? No, it's a social contract. But I think that social contract can be tied to a lot of brutality, a lot of murderous ways that disconnects people from their humanity. And whether or not that is a mental illness, I'll leave it to y'all to decide. Yeah. Oh, I think I can end on that note. I think I can end on that note, like that segment. So, yeah, I hope y'all get it. I hope that was received well. I hope I hope y'all listen past the question, okay? Because I know that there's a tendency not to do that. Okay, so moving on to Ask Dr. Durag, which is one of my favorite segments because I like interacting with y'all and answering y'all's questions. Today's question comes from Ruby, and Ruby asks, what advice can you give to someone who feels like they don't have a purpose or passion in life? Okay, and this is going to come back to this advice that I give my clients all the time, right? That the advice that was given to me, and is that you have to find your why. And sometimes it can feel like you're feeling around in the dark looking for a purpose, but life again has meaning that we give it. All of these things have meaning that we give it, and you can find what meaning you want to paint life with on your own. But one of the things that helped me when I was feeling a lack of passion and a lack of direction in my own life was making the passion and direction for me finding out why I don't have it. Okay, that sounds convoluted, but when I did not have a reason or a passion to get up and start my days, my passion became figuring out why I didn't have it. So finding my why was the why. And then after I sought out on the journey of finding out why I needed to do things and why I didn't have a passion, I also in turn found out why again. I rediscovered that I'm really passionate about people, about community, about helping others. So if you are in a position where you feel like you don't have a passion, make your passion figuring out why you don't have one. And the thing about it is that we don't understand fully how much free will we have because of social conditioning. But the reality is, you can get out and you can just try new stuff. What's that hobby you always wanted to pick up? What are some groups that you would want to sit in and hear them discuss and talk, right? What are some activities you can get into that can spark some curiosity? What type of books do you want to read? Media do you want to watch? Like, you need to explore. And I really encourage people to get in tune with their inner explorer and try and find a connection with with just the world around you. Be curious. Be curious. That is the way that you develop a passion. You have to like try new things, go new places, talk to new people. And I know we live in a very isolative world where the like loneliness crisis is at a head, but in order for you to figure out what you can be passionate about, you have to figure out how other people have found their passions. Sometimes we are lucky enough to have it living deep within us. Sometimes the passion that we thought we had fizzles out because it was rooted in something that doesn't make sense anymore. So even like in terms of that, for a long time I was so driven with the idea of like getting out of the hood. Like, I'm from the hood. Like, I did not want to like stay in the hood. Being impoverished was really just the biggest motivation for me to work really hard to get very far in life. But once I got out of my immediate environment, I realized like, okay, I'm not there anymore. Nothing is driving me passionately. So I had to rediscover what it is that can make me feel whole, could make me feel like I wanted to get up and attack the days. There will be multiple time periods in your life where you have to rediscover why you want to get out of bed in the morning. And if you center first why, okay, finding your why, that is a start. I think that is easily what I would mark as the beginning of that journey. And you have to be curious through the process. Be curious. Try new things. Talk with your friends. Talk with your loved ones. Community. Okay? That's key too. And if you don't have community, figure out why and how. How can you get it? And I was just oddly enough, I was talking to one of my clients yesterday and I was telling them like the importance of asking questions, right? Therapy is nothing but asking questions. Okay, there's a lot more than just asking questions, but I consider myself to be a professional question asker. And the more you develop an affinity for asking yourself questions, being introspective, the more you will grow. Okay, you can't even grieve without asking yourself questions with kindness. But when you learn how to ask questions and be introspective and to act upon those questions out of curiosity, you will find that you'll move a lot quicker through life. So if you want to find a purpose and passion, ask yourself the question, why? What's my why? If I don't know what the why is, why don't I have it? What can I do to get it? Ask yourself these questions. And I hope this was a helpful answer to that too. But to anybody struggling to find their passion, just know that curiosity will be the way out. That is the guiding light. And don't feel like you can't just try something new. Sometimes you need to just change things up, and it may be painful at first, but you cannot grow without being willing to feel pain. Ironically, the more you avoid pain, the longer you sit in it. It's an oxymoronic thing, I know, but you have to be willing to feel the hurt of going through transitions in order for you to transition into something better. Okay. Oh, the pain of becoming a butterfly fresh out of a chrysalis. I know. I know. With that being said, our next segment is going to be What's Your Anthem? And this is where we share like an anthem, like a piece of media, anything that's been keeping us sane. It's a lot going on in the world, don't get me wrong, but I still find a way to always have a jam, a jam going. And I want to hear from y'all too. Like, if you have an anthem that's been keeping you sane, please leave it in the comments, leave it on the YouTube video, subscribe to it. I'm subtly letting you know that you should subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's doing really good. So thank you for tuning in and all that jazz. But if you have an anthem, let it be known. But mine's today is gonna be Squabble Up. Yo, Kendrick Lamar is like hands down the king of rap. Like I think he's earned that title at this point. I think Kendrick Lamar is one of the best rappers to ever touch a mic. And I know a lot of people get upset by that for some reason. When I say it, every time I say it on social media, people say that it's like such a milk toast opinion, but I really do believe that Kendrick Lamar is that nigga. He is. And Squabble Up is just like really a nod to how authentic he is to his LA roots. And I think he has something that a lot of people lack, and that's a connection to culture. So yeah. Yeah. Squabble Up. Squabble up. Squabble up. Yeah, that's going to be mine for today. And lastly, for the toolkit, what I'm going to recommend naturally, My Grandmother's Hands. This book is so beautiful. It's by Resma Menachem. I think I say his name right, but I'm always like, am I saying Menachem right? But Resma and My Grandmother's Hand, the full title is My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. As someone who practices EMDR therapy, which is a form of somatic therapy, like you have to heal trauma in the body before you can heal anything else. So if you ever want to pick up a book that is going to help you dive a little deeper into these concepts, My Grandmother's Hands is the way to go. And it really ties it beautifully to mental health and how trauma is intergenerational and how that works. You ain't got to take my word for it though, but I do believe you should check it out. With that being said, too, I have some exciting stuff coming up, some guests that I'm excited for y'all to hear. Thank you again for tuning in with me continually. All of y'all have been rocking with me, and I just cannot thank you enough. This has been such a beautiful, eye-opening experience. I was doing a newsletter for so long, and I think this is a preferred way of connecting with y'all. I want y'all to hear my thoughts. I want y'all to hear other people's thoughts. I want to hear y'all's thoughts. I have some people from the audience who have finally said that they wanted to come on, so I'll be having some episodes recording with people soon. Look out for those soon. And just thank you so much for tuning in. Please leave a positive review, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Over and out. Love y'all down. And remember, please remember, you are doing much better than you know. Thanks for tuning in, y'all. And yeah, shouts out to everybody.